This video is brought to you by my lovely supporters on patreon.com, such as Sanderson Boosel, who is my first new Patreon this month. Thanks, Sanderson. Everything that you love about Magic the Gathering exists exclusively because of silver border cards, and it ought to have been a violation of the Geneva Convention for Wizards to have removed them from the game. Thanks for watching, folks, and a massive thank you to all of my patrons who make videos like... What do you mean that's not nearly enough analysis or nuance? Fine, I'll do it properly. Hello, spicy people of the internet. Spice 8-Rack here, aka the other sock which you just can't find, and Magic the Gathering is not a serious game. You throw bees at rabbit mutants, and its rules allow for a bear to pilot an evangelical star destroyer, provided you shove it in a wedding dress first. But fiction like Magic cannot exist without its fantastical or unrealistic elements and tropes being treated with a certain degree of sincerity. A separation has to exist between the strange things that are considered as normal within any given world and the cultural or scientific absurdities that are just as wild to in-universe characters as they would be to us. However, on occasion, creators of worlds like these will purposefully pull back this sincerity, interrogate your suspension of disbelief, lampoon the ridiculousness of their worlds and tropes, and even criticize the medium in which their stories are being told in the first place. Sometimes this can be done to incredible effect, like how Airplane iconically deconstructed disaster movies for an entire generation of film goers. Or it can be done terribly, like And just sometimes, spoofs can not only succeed as pastiches of their own worlds, thread the needle, 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 nailed it, but they can also go on to influence and inspire the serious work that comes after them. In 1998, Wizards of the Coast released Unglued, the first unset of its kind. It was a small set of less than 100 silver border cards which irrevocably changed the course of Magic's games design forever. The set was hotly received, full of bizarre mechanics and meta humor which often poked fun at the very idea of Magic, as well as Wizards of the Coast themselves, and which acted as an invaluable testing ground for innovative design that would later go on to become Magic the Gathering mainstays. And then the company tried to do it again, and it wasn't so good. Wasn't so good that time. But then they tried it again, and it was really good. It was fantastic. And then they tried it again, and it was just kind of mid. Sorry, Gavin. And then they killed the silver border off entirely and fundamentally changed what it meant to be an unset. So, welcome to the video. This is the underappreciated, kill me, history of Magic the Gathering's silver border. How it was born, the trials it went through, the impact it's had on our game, and why it has now been relegated to a piece of history in the archives of Magic, alongside the Intimidate mechanic and my once passionate interest in Magic the Gathering's lore. I sure do wish that War of the Spark Forsaken had been printed in a silver border. Laugh or I will break into your house. Our story begins well before the release of Magic's first silver-bordered set. Back in 1997, 1 year after I was born and 28 years before my dark past would finally catch up to me in a hail of gunfire, the idea of Unglued was first given form. As Mark Rosewater retells it in a 2004 article on the subject, then senior games designer for Magic Joel Mick and Bill Rose, Magic's brand manager, were having a conversation about cards. Cards that had slipped through the cracks of Magic's design.
Joel and Bill Rose were talking about the cards that slipped through the cracks. And they came up with a wonderful idea. What if Wizards put out a set that could print all those cards that just didn't seem to have a place in real Magic? The set could also explore moods and tones that would be inappropriate in a normal set. something that would remind the public that Wizards of the Coast understood that Magic was more than just a tournament game. Joel and Bill thought it was a great idea. So Joel said to Bill, put someone on it.
Now, only 5 people worked full-time in Wizards R&D back then, and of those 5 people, the person who Bill put on the task was a then mostly obscure games designer at Wizards who was best known by the team for having both a comedic and a stage Magic background. This was the first set that this designer had ever been a full creative lead on, and so he needed to knock it out of the park. The name of that designer? Serena Williams. No, it's Mark Rosewater. Mark Rosewater designed Unglued. At first, Rosewater assumed that the pitch of a tournament illegal parody set which broke every existing rule in Magic and which would poke fun directly at Wizards of the Coast themselves was a joke in of itself. Personally, if my old boss came up to me and asked if I wanted to put a slide in the next search engine optimization report that would moon the executives he was presenting it to, I would assume that this was a test I had to say no to in order to not be fired. However, the pitch was genuine, and Rosewater took up the role as lead designer on the set. Also, due to the lack of staff at Wizards at the time, Mark Rosewater was also the entire development team on the set as well. Boy, I bet he checked to make sure his overtime sheet wasn't being printed in a silver border. Ho 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 ho. As you can imagine, being given that degree of executive power on a creative project with literally no boundaries outside of the fact that it needed to be funny in some way must have been brain-melting. But what eventually came out of this design process was one of the most genuinely innovative sets of Magic cards ever printed up until that point. And that's not me speaking in hyperbole. There are ideas first trialed in Unglued that have since become basic components to how this game functions. But we'll get into that in a second. First, I want to jump into this set for anyone who's never actually had a proper look at it before. Unglued is a non-stop jab at Magic as it existed up until its printing. Out were the stalwart knights and fierce Phyrexians. In came Clambassadors with unapologetically cartoonish art and flavor text ripped straight out of Magic's history and injected with one of the most atrocious puns the game has ever seen.
Sorry we shelled your village. Here's some gold.
You had direct parodies of well-known Magic cards, but also concepts around Magic itself. Timmy, the power gamer, is meant to represent Timmy, one of the 3 quote-unquote kinds of Magic player that Mark Rosewater and others have written at length about. Chaos Confetti is a direct jab at Chaos Orb and pokes fun at similar manual dexterity effects from Magic's past, effects that are considered to be absolute blunders of Magic's early games design. Blacker Lotus also had you tearing the card to shreds to gain its effect, and this could be a joke or a jab or a comment on just so much. Is this a jab at the monetary value of Black Lotus, making you tear up its fetish, committing a cardinal collectible sin? Is it a comment about the self-sacrifice of Magic players, those who would readily pay all of their life, exile their entire library and sacrifice all of their permanents if it gave them even the slightest edge over their opponents? Is it a statement on how game pieces have lost their use value, have become exclusively commodities to be traded? After all, if you can still play with a Blacker Lotus, then that card has never been truly played with before, has never once embodied its use. What does that mean for creators to know that the continued existence of their work is necessarily because their work has never realized what that work is intended to do? The task for which it was designed? Is that the truest form of alienation one can ever experience from the fruits of one's labour? Also, hot dang, there are just a lot of unapologetically horny cards in this set. Denial has a premature ejaculation gag in it. Censorship is... I mean, look at it. And then you just have handcuffs.
That was fun. Now me, Gwendolyn de Courtsey.
Unglued was an utterly unapologetic piss take of Magic the Gathering, and whilst the mechanics of cards like foul play wouldn't spin too many heads today, at the time it was a wild ride. Why did I say it like that? But returning to that innovation I alluded to earlier, did you know that Unglued was the first Magic the Gathering set to ever include tokens? Magic had cards which created tokens in the game before, but the designers always expected players to use dice or scraps of paper or those little glass beads that always looked so delicious in a forbidden and taboo kind of way. The Unglued design team, aka Mark Rosewater and the demons I'm sure the stress of making this set awoke in him, knew that the silliness of this set was a surefire way of attracting casual players, but they also wanted to put game pieces in the set that would appeal to more experienced players as well. One of these features was Rosewater's idea of full art tokens that players could use in tournaments to represent any and all token creatures they may want to make, an idea that Mark Rosewater stumbled across on a visit to Japan, where he saw LGSs selling custom tokens that players then used in various different card games. Not only are these tokens flat out gorgeous, with the Unglued goblin, zombie and squirrel being the best versions of their respective tokens in my opinion, and I maintain that Pete Venter's drawn the horniest goblins in Magic. Don't try and deny it, Pete. Don't try and deny the truth, I'll make a video about it to prove it, I swear to God. But players welcomed access to official Magic tokens within booster packs so unanimously that they became player rewards and eventually printed in every single Magic set from the early 2000s onwards. Another thing pioneered in Unglued, again as a way for the set to appeal to both casual and more dedicated Magic players, were full art lands. Yeah, that's right, the set that introduced both tokens and full art lands into Magic the Gathering is the same set which printed cards like The Cheese Stands Alone. You're welcome. Wait, hang on, I've read that rules text before. Yeah, hang on, this is the exact same card as Barren Glory. How much of Magic did this set influence? Oh my god. Yeah, if pioneering staple elements of Magic's core aesthetic and design wasn't enough, Unglued also laid the foundation for a bunch of future cards and mechanics. The BFM is a plainly silly card, requiring you to play both halves at the same time in order to summon a 99/99 creature with the type biggest, baddest, nastiest, scariest creature you'll ever see. However, this mechanic would be re-implemented nearly 20 years later in normal Magic in Eldritch Moon with the meld mechanic, where two creatures would combine and transform into one bigger, badder, nastier, scarier creature that everybody always wanted to see hit the table. I don't know at what point in that sentence I transitioned my accent into this one, but it happened at some point and I am very confused as to why it did. That was weird. Anyway, dice rolling was also used in this set, which not only became a theme for subsequent unsets, but also was implemented more seriously in Magic's foray into the Forgotten Realms. Many cards in Unglued referred to you and your teammates taking actions together, which became the entire central theme of Battle Bond and Battle Bond 2, Battle Boogaloo, I assume is going to be the subtitle of that. Now, we're going to go back to The Cheese Stands Alone for a moment, because believe it or not, it lies at the centre of a very important decision that Wizards of the Coast made very early on in the Silver Borders history. I could tell you about that decision myself, but luckily I found the password to a Zoom call scrawled on the bathroom wall of my local Sainsbury's, which led me to talk to somebody who was around during the development of Unglued. Can you tell me a little bit more about how The Cheese Stands Alone was potentially going to be included in 8th edition?
Sometime in the middle of making 8th edition, I pitched an idea. I think it was like the anniversary of Magic. I forget which anniversary, the 15th, the 20th, one of the anniversaries of Magic. And so I pitched this idea of what if there was one card from every set we'd ever done. And we did in fact do that promotion. That was in 8th edition. But we entertained the idea of doing a card from Unglued because Unglued had been a product we released. And the card, The Cheese Stands Alone, was able to, it did work in the normal rules. In fact, we later made the card. We had to change the name, but we made the card. It actually worked in the rules. So we're like, we could put this in a set. It works in the rules. But the problem was it had a silver border, and we couldn't make a black border of a silver border card at the time because we didn't mix the two. I mean, nowadays with Unfinity coming out, we're experimenting with having black bordered uncards. But at the time, that wasn't something we did, and so we thought about it, but we ended up not doing it.
Now, I want to talk about this decision for a little bit, because it set a precedent which would eventually lead to the destruction of the silver border. But first, I need to talk about how the silver border actually came about. Rosewater knew that some kind of separation was needed in order to ensure that uncards didn't mistakenly get included in tournament decks by new players, and Wizards had actually given him a solution a year before Unglued was to be printed. In 1997, a series of World Championship decks were printed. These were tournament-winning deck lists, printed with golden borders, the signature of the deck's pilot, and a unique back which prevented them from being played in regular tournaments. Kind of like official proxies. I mean, after all, if you'd printed a deck which contained 4 copies of Force of Will, you would have severely deflated the trading portfolio of card collectors, and that would have been, my notes are saying bad, but that doesn't sound right. Now, of course, gold border cards were reprints that you just couldn't officially play in tournaments, and so the silver border came about as a secondary distinction, one that said, "Yes, this is a new Magic card, see? But don't try and jam me into your Necrotog shell, you utter maniac! I do not fly that way!" But this left the 8th edition designers in a pickle. As I said before, gold border cards were just tournament illegal versions of tournament legal Magic cards, and could be printed in subsequent black borders. But silver border cards had never been tournament legal, and printing one in black border would fundamentally change how that card and all future versions of that card would work. The decision was made that any card originally printed in the silver border could never be printed in the black border. This wouldn't stop text that had originally appeared on silver border cards from being printed on black border cards, but it would mean that it would technically have to appear on a brand new Magic card. Still, the precedent set by this decision laid the foundation for the downfall of the silver border over 20 years later. For a long while, however, all was rosy. Rosy water, if you will. 6 years after the release of this set, Mark Rosewater would write in an article on Magic's Mothership saying,
"Unglued is my personal favorite set. It was the set that allowed me to bridge my old life as a comedy writer, for those who hadn't picked up on my subtle clues, and my new life as a Magic designer." Alright, so that's my very bad Mark Rosewater impression. I feel like that's like, you can maybe think of it as like a Weird Al genre parody.
This bridging of the gap may seem obvious, but as I hope you can appreciate now, it is of incredibly important note. Looking through Unglued and indeed many unsets, we can see the primordial form of Magic cards of the future. Unsets and joke cards make a perfect place for safe experimentation with the limits of Magic. Because no card could ever be played in an official tournament, could never threaten the meta of any eternal format, and because anybody who picked up a silver bordered card knew at a glance that it wasn't to be taken seriously, designers had the creative version of a blank check to work with. It didn't matter if a uncard was unplayable or unfair, provided it was Jesus Christ, it could find its home in the set. And this experimentation led to the printing of cards which act as a functional first draft of serious Magic mechanics. The comedy of Unglued even extended past the set itself, with joke articles like this one by Aaron Forsyth, which detailed how a card which allowed you to hit your opponent over the head with a shovel was cut from development. Regardless of the fact that this is a joke, the removal of a fictional card which caused players to undertake unnecessary and unfun physical activity does foreshadow one of the many issues with Magic's next attempt at an unset, which was a real pain in the ass. Is it okay that my video about Magic's joke sets is just deeply unfunny? Unhinged. Unhinged was released 6 years after Unglued, which may sound like a long time, but is actually pretty consistent with most of Magic's revisitations of its popular worlds. There was a 7-year gap between original Ravnica and Return to Ravnica, a 6-year gap between Zendikar and Battle for Zendikar, and it's been 20 years since Lorwyn came out, and we'll be back any day now. You just wait. They wouldn't abandon my boy. They wouldn't abandon my boy. Unglued was a hit, and Unhinged was set to continue that magic, with over 160 new cards, new full art basics, foil treatments, the works. Except, it just didn't. Indeed, comparing Mark Rosewater's glowing love for Unglued with his perspective on Unhinged is quite stark.
While there are a lot of individual cards in Unhinged I am proud of, I feel that the set as a whole was a bit of a letdown. In particular, I now believe that Gotcha was one of the worst mechanics I've ever designed, and it sucked the fun out of what was supposed to be an extra fun format.
One of the major differences between Unhinged and Unglued was the inclusion of consistent keyword mechanics. Gotcha was a mechanic which had a trigger where if an opponent said one of the words in the name of the card or did some other specific action, you got to say gotcha and return that card from your graveyard to your hand. In theory, it was a funny memory challenge for your opponents to play with. In reality, it was just awkward and annoying. Any natural flow of conversation in a game having to stop and start as players robotically replaced words in their vocabulary. Like, there's a removal spell in this set, which you get to return to your hand for free if your opponent ever says a number. You can only imagine how quickly this gets old. Some gotcha moments would also entirely ruin your game. Your opponent returning Laughing Hyena or Save Life from their yard is one thing. Returning Kill, Destroy or Spell Counter would completely turn the tables of any given match, and it never felt good when it did. There was also an ass tribal theme in this set as well, which just felt like the designers were trying way too hard. And that's my job! The previous set had chickens and clams, whose obvious martial impotence made their inclusion as creature types for you to fight with funny, and the next unset had a whole host of wacky creatures all with their own humorous design. However, the asses of Unhinged just don't land comedically, and also don't particularly land mechanically. I spoke with Gavin Verhey, principal game designer at Wizards of the Coast, about Magic's unsets to get some more clarity on his perspective on Unhinged.
I think it was over the line in the wrong ways. I remember showing my mom some cards and she was like, wait, what did they call these donkey folk? It wasn't just that it felt inappropriate for Magic, but that it was putting a huge emphasis on crude humor. Unhinged cards were a lot of what we call webcomic designs. I think Aaron Forsythe penned the term. They're funny to read, but they play horribly.
A key example of this quote-unquote webcomic design in Unhinged for me is clearly the theme of fractions in rules text, stat blocks, and mana costs. Looking at a magic card which deals 3.5 damage is funny for a moment, but actually playing with cards which combine these fractions into whole numbers felt neither satisfying nor funny. At best, they played exactly like normal magic cards with the extra half point of damage or the like not really having any real effect on the board, and at worst, they were tedious with multiple fractions stacking on top of one another to make the maths of a game take longer than normal. The designers of Unstable, a phenomenal set that we'll talk about later, very much recognised how a mechanic like this is only really fun for a moment, printing exactly one card whose maths extended outside of whole numbers with the Thrown Pi burn spell which did pi damage. Now, it's not just naff asses and annoying fractions which make Unhinged a bad unset. There are a number of other issues with it as well. Physical challenges being a huge one from my perspective. There were physical challenges in Unglued. Mesa Chicken had you flap your arms like a chicken to grant it flying, but Unhinged turned the intensity, frequency, and scale of these challenges up to a truly obnoxious level. You had staring contests, held breath contests, restricted your opponents to one or no arms, restricted yourself to only playing with locked arms, forcing yourself to not take your fingers off of a card, having to stay standing to give a card vigilance, having to arm wrestle over a 3-3. Now, luckily, I've only ever been defeated once in an arm wrestle in my entire life because my core is so robust and my technique is flawless, but the rest of these are just wildly inconvenient. To me, the card head-to-head represents the absolute worst of all of these kinds of physical or linguistic challenges that the game threw at you. Head-to-head is an instant where you and target opponent play 7 questions about the top card of their library, and if by the end of that you can correctly guess what that card is, you win and you get the effect. Now, 7 questions probably last for at least a minute, if not longer, and so you'd expect the effect that you'd get from this card to be somewhat game-changing. But the effect of the card is just pay no heed. It's just the card Pay No Heed, but with 7 questions stapled onto it. So it's a worse Pay No Heed, because not only do you always give your opponent a free scry, but if you don't win the 7 questions, you don't know what they're going to draw next, and you don't get to prevent damage. It's so obnoxious! Even one of the more interesting ideas in Unhinged, the Artist Matters mechanic, was doomed from the start to be woefully unimpactful. Many cards in Unhinged affected other cards based on their artist, or gave you benefits when you controlled more cards with the same artist. But, as is the case with most Magic sets, very few artists provide work for more than 1 or 2 cards. The only artist who produced art for over 3 cards in the entire set is John Avon, and that's only because 5 of his 8 pieces were the set's full basic lands. With such a low chance of artistic consistency in sealed decks, it's highly unlikely that cards like Persecute Artist, Drawn Together, or Framed will ever affect more than 1 or 2 cards on the board at any given time. This would also lead to the unfortunate side effect of players scrabbling to find lands from 1 or 2 specific artists in the release event's land boxes to make their copies of Frame be even more impactful game pieces. To compare Unhinged to another unset once again on this theme, Unglued had exactly 1 Artist Matters card in the entire set, Squirrel Farm, which had you reveal a card from your hand and your opponent had to guess the artist, and if they got it wrong, you got a 1/1 squirrel. Yay! It's a simple, fun minigame which doesn't outstay its welcome and which has you making a genuine strategic decision. A, what artist to reveal that your opponent might not be able to guess, and B, whether or not creating a 1/1 at instant speed is worth giving up information about your hand to your opponent. It's truly quite wild that both Unglued and Unstable have exactly 1 card each that cares about artists and fractions respectively, and both of these single cards are more interesting and cleaner explorations of each idea than every relevant card from Unhinged combined. Boy, I bet the game's designers wish they'd printed Unhinged in a silver border. Ho ho! Wait, that fully doesn't make any sense. But how did this happen? How did Unhinged go so wrong where Unglued went so right? Frustratingly, there's a lot that's been written about what made Unglued work and retrospectives on how it came to be, but vanishingly little about why Unhinged didn't. We do, however, have some articles written at the time Unhinged was coming out about the design process, and there's one particular part in one of these that I think reveals a fundamental issue. In an article titled and Games, Rosewater lays out what he and his team set up as the parameters for what designs could be included in the coming unset. The first of these parameters was that any card which could be printed in black border as is, or with very minor adjustments, would be cut from the set. This may seem like a no-brainer. After all, when Unstable came out, one of the main criticisms levied against it by the player base was that too many of the cards in that set seemed like they didn't belong in an unset. But I think this thinking had a disastrous effect. Not only would this mean that cards like The Cheese Stands Alone would be removed from the set, denying future designers the chance to see how this and other potentially black bordered mechanics would work in the wild, but it also meant that the set felt utterly saturated with gags and bizarre rules. Again, that may seem like the point of a comedy set, and it worked for Unglued, but there were again reasons for that. Unglued, with its comparatively tiny card pool, made room for at least some cards with less wacky effects that didn't need to be remembered by all players at all times. Without even a small number of normal-ish Magic cards, every card played in a game of Unhinged was elbowing for the comedic spotlight. Anybody who has seen a comedy film knows that not every line can nor should be a gag. Even the most joke-saturated movies I can think of, like Naked Gun or Airplane, have had to have the occasional serious line or comparatively normal scene. Comedy doesn't work with no normality to contrast it against. Similarly, with Unhinged having no cards that could find a home in normal Magic, the comedy and off-the-wall design of many cards fell flat due to having nothing mundane to contrast it to in any given game. Please don't tell people how I live. Now, the card pool of Unglued may have been comparatively less saturated with cheap gags, but it wasn't exactly reserved either. So there must have been some additional factor that gave it an edge over Unhinged when it came to its comedy sticking. And when I asked Gavin about this, he gave me some very insightful perspective.
As a Magic designer, I'd say that the first time you do something, it has a lot of leeway, just because it's novel. Unglued, in retrospect, wasn't exactly a banger of a set either, but it picked some low-hanging fruit and did something nobody expected. Unhinged may have been worse mechanically, but also the novelty bubble had already been burst. And keep in mind how small of a set Unglued was. It was more of something you'd open a pack of and smile at than anything else, where Unhinged had whole release events. Unstable succeeded because it was not just funny, but good Magic too.
I realise I've been taking Unhinged apart for the past few minutes, but this isn't to say that there were no interesting ideas explored in the set. When I first saw this set as a very new Magic player, Blast from the Past and Old Fogey were cards that fascinated me as I tried to work out from context alone what any of these keywords meant. There were amazing bits of humour in this set as well, my favourites easily being Tainted Monkey and that delightfully desperate flavour text.
Come on, choose monkey. Everybody loves monkeys.
Stop That as well is not only the only gotcha card that I like, but I genuinely think it's a phenomenal bit of matching mechanics to meta comedy, punishing people who flick their cards in their hand by slowly making them discard cards until they either learn their lesson or they physically can't flick them anymore. I love this. No notes, it's perfect. Additionally, there were a couple of cards whose outlandish mechanics would make it into black border print, albeit fewer than other unsets. Booster Tutor, for example, would inspire the Lore Seeker card from the original Conspiracy Draft format, and whilst Staying Power's effects haven't been introduced into any black border card as of yet, I really do think it'll only be a matter of time. Unhinged also had a number of experimental foil cards, like Goblin Mime, whose foil version revealed the invisible box he was trapped in, and Gleemax, whose foil version contained a hidden message. This kind of treatment hadn't been experimented with before in Magic, and its use in Unhinged pretty much paved the way for all alternative art foils in normal Magic, like the Rowan and Will foils from Battlebond. Whether or not this was needful innovation or the opening of the floodgates on 1,000,001 different monetizable versions of every Magic card ever printed is pretty much a personal perspective. Unfortunately, the hit that Unglued had been was not replicated with Unhinged, especially in a financial sense, and for over a decade, the future of Magic silver bordered cards seemed pretty bleak.
With Unhinged, we didn't end up selling all the product we'd printed, and in the end, we had to, again, destroy product. The prevailing wisdom at the company was that the sets were failures, and there was no reason to ever print another. That's, what we were up against.
Sam, I'm really sorry. You're not going to hear this feedback until after this video has gone public and this is live, but your impression is giving less Mark Rosewater and more Gilbert Gottfried from fucking Aladdin. There is a palpable irony in a format designed to be experimental being shelved because the latest experiment in that format didn't go exactly according to plan. One of the main issues with the profit motive being at the core of all production is how it leaves no room for error. Sure, we can learn from failed experiments and the next attempt will be better for it, but failure doesn't generate short-term revenue, so well, can it? Yeah, that's right, I'm blaming capitalism for nearly killing a bit of Magic the Gathering that I like because it had too many ass cards on it. Look, if I purposefully read Marx wrong, it's impossible for him to disagree with me on this. Broadly speaking, Magic's silver border seemed to have a short but deeply impactful life, and by the time Unhinged had long since passed from the forefront of players' minds, already some of those original experiments and innovations from Unglued were becoming mainstays of Magic's design. It seemed like a neat little end. But then, during an otherwise perfectly interesting product announcement 13 years later, this happened.
Well, that was a nice glimpse into Magic's future. Got a few tricks up our sleeves still, but that's what we're looking forward to over the next year.
Nate, you haven't finished yet, have you?
No.
Okay, so we're not going to finish without telling them, you know.
Yes, we are. Liz specifically said we couldn't tell them anything.
Nothing? I mean, come on, this is the whole...
No.
Is this still filming?
Yes.
It's called Unstable. It comes out December 8th. It's all the fun of a Silver Border set, but with like a modern design sensibility and a cohesive creative treatment.
Magic's third and surprise outing in the format may have seemed to have come out of nowhere, but it had actually been in the works for quite a while. This was also the first unset I was around to experience the release of. It was before I started making videos, but I recall the palpable excitement between me and my friends of finally being able to play with an unset as it came out, rather than what we'd been doing previously, which had been occasionally playing with already opened Unhinged cards that we picked up from our local comic book store. The thing about this set that excited me the most, and I think this will be shared with a lot of Magic players, was the reprinting of a long speculated over Future Sight card, Steam Flogger Boss, and perhaps more importantly, the long awaited fleshing out of what a contraption is and what assembling one implied.
So contraptions are a very interesting story where when we made Future Sight, we threw some jokes in Future Sight that we had no plans of ever doing. And Steam Flogger Boss literally was just R&D having fun. We're like, it'd be fun to write nonsense words on the card. You know what I'm saying? And like, that was kind of the joke was, here's words that don't mean anything. And then Aaron Forsyth, who used to have a column at the time, told the audience that we had no plans to do anything with it. And then we were doomed. Then like, of course we have to make it. The audience like, well, now you have to make it. And I spent years trying to figure out how to make contraptions. But the problem I ran into was, whenever I tried to sort of put them in a normal set, like I had to so streamline them that they just didn't feel wacky enough. Like I didn't want to say, finally, we finally make contraptions, and it's like an artifact you tap or something. Like that didn't feel like it sold it. So when we were in Unstable, we're like, okay, we're going to do contraptions. We had, because we were doing factions, we're like, we could do the Steam Floggers as a faction. And so we really said, what was the coolest way? Like, what makes a contraption? And the idea was, I want you to be able to build something that every game it'll be different and it'll do cool things, but you can combine things and you can build it in a way that neat things can happen, that combinations were built into it. And that's how it was built. Like I've been wanting to do a separate deck forever. I think additional decks are a lot of fun space. And another example of like really cool things that we're not supposed to do in normal Magic, or maybe one day, but no one will let me do it yet. But it's really fun for people who enjoy that kind of thing. And so I'm really excited. Contraptions turned out great. I'm really happy with them.
Steam Flogger Boss being reprinted in an unset, albeit the only card in said set without a silver border, I think speaks volumes for the similarity between black border and silver border experimentation in Magic. And as a follow-on from that, the safety silver border gives to games designers in comparison to the eternal ramifications of pushing the boat out in black border. To go on a very slight tangent, Future Sight's Future Border cards are what happens when experimental games design is unleashed directly into Magic with little in the way of buffering. Aven Mind Sensor, Daybreak Coronet, Narcomoeba, Street Wraith, Bridge from Below, and Tarmogoyf all became instant staples across a variety of decks throughout every Magic format with the release of Future Sight. Some even became linchpins of entirely new deck archetypes. Whilst the meta of Eternal formats has since developed to the point where many of these game pieces aren't nearly the must-includes they used to be, for many years, not playing decks which included them put you at a disadvantage. And what's worse, it took years for many of these cards to see mass reprints, meaning that they were both high in demand and very low in supply. I wonder how that may influence the price of something. But I digress. Back to Unstable itself, and when it finally did release, as I said before, it did so to a mixture of reactions. In the majority, there was jubilation, excitement, and appreciation for the triumphant return of the silver border and of unsets in general. In the minority, there were dissatisfied people, concerned about what they saw as a dilution of what the silver border meant. To these people, cards like Beast in Show and Amateur Auteur were betrayals of what it meant to be silver border, seeing as the only thing stopping these cards being printed in black border was either their aesthetic silliness or their meta jokes. But I'll get back to why this is an incorrect perspective in a little bit. I'd like to start with the positives. Unstable was objectively a huge step up in terms of quality when compared to Unhinged. Keyword mechanics returned, but out were the half-arsed, pardon the pun, attempts at tribal synergies, annoying memory games, poorly conceived artist matters mechanics, and even the physical challenges were massively toned down. Replacing all of that gubbins were a range of mechanics that toyed with Magic's meta, both comedically and mechanically, some mechanics that could have well made it into Black Border if not for their aesthetic silliness, and others which were so inaccessibly complicated that it made your first reading of the banding mechanic look like where the wild things are in comparison. Dice rolling made a return in this set. Last Strike is an excellent example of good webcomic design, which is comedic the first time you look at it, but whose mechanics don't outstay their welcome, and Watermark Matters entered the fray as a simple yet silly mechanic that I think is a massive upgrade over Artist Matters mechanics. Comedically, I view the Watermark Matters cards from Unstable to be a jab at that trope of Magic set design, which is to create worlds with 5 clearly draftable factions in them. When you're building a sealed or draft deck in Magic, you tend to look out for the watermarks of whatever faction you're trying to build, as those signify that they are likely to synergize with cards that have that same watermark. Unstable takes that and cuts out the middleman. Cards with the same watermarks synergize in Unstable, not because the faction's mechanics work well with the mechanics of other cards in that faction, but rather simply by virtue of having the watermark of that faction somewhere on their card. Going back to the other mechanics of Unstable, there was even a very light tribal theme with squirrels, although even this, when compared to similar uncards from the previous set, is a massive step up in terms of humorous and interesting design. The Earl of Squirrel, for example, gives +1/+1 to squirrels and uses the very silly keyword Squirrel Link, which turns combat damage into squirrels, as well as turning tokens into squirrels in order to ensure that its ability will have some impact in the game. Whereas Asquatch from Unhinged gave all donkeys an enter the battlefield threaten effect, and a fractional anthem, which we've already discussed is often useless and bland. In fact, there are many standalone silly cards that just clicked better in Unstable over Unhinged. Looking at two very similar removal spells from both sets, Capital Offense from Unstable and When Fluffy Bunnies Attack from Unhinged, you can instantaneously see a more streamlined design in the former. When you cast When Fluffy Bunnies Attack, you read a creature's name and will always pick the most common letter. The choice the game gives you here is a false one, because whilst you could choose any letter, there's no time where you would ever not pick the most common one for the maximum effect. Compare this to Capital Offense, which has a similarly silly way for you to kill creatures, but removes the needless false choice, speeding up gameplay whilst not sacrificing comedy. Okay, I'm done bashing Unhinged now. I'm done bashing Unhinged, I swear. In terms of the stuff Unstable did that was brand new, it had two unique mechanics: contraptions and augments. The latter was the faction mechanic for Crossbreed Labs, aka Simic but honest about how fucked they are, and the former was used by all factions, but most often by White and Blue's Order of the Widget and Red and Green's Goblin Explosioneers, essentially guaranteeing that no matter what faction you played, there would always be abundant means to assemble contraptions in your colours. The augment mechanic saw you play host creatures to later attach augment creatures onto them, changing their abilities, stats, and creature types, and more! This mechanic was a heady mix of surreal aesthetics with mechanical seriousness. No augment card had you do a campy little dance to activate its host ability, but it was also nearly impossible to make a quote-unquote serious looking combined creature. For every time your opponent created something halfway genuine like a multi-headed Stegosaurus, there would be 10 times they'd create something like a zombified beaver or a half kitten, half kitten. Contraptions were Unstable's other mechanic, and very in fitting with the kakistocratic aesthetics of Bablovia, the plane of Unstable, they were wildly convoluted. Hello, spicy people of the internet, it's Spice8Rack here, and I thought I'd just do a real quick rundown on how the contraption mechanic works in case you in the audience don't fully grasp what I am talking about. Don't worry, it's very, very simple. I will explain it to you right now. So, when you are drafting a card from your unstable draft, you can even have the option of putting it in your main deck. This is stuff for instants and sorceries and enchantments and stuff like that. Or you can, if you pick a contraption, it goes in your contraption deck. This deck is separate both from your main deck and your sideboard. You can only interact with cards from this if you have a card that has the assemble, reassemble, or crank keyword. When you assemble a contraption, you take the top card of your contraption deck, which you must shuffle, and place it into one of 3 sprockets. When it's in this sprocket, it means that when the crank counter moves onto that sprocket, all of the contraptions in that sprocket will activate. The crank counter begins its life on the 3rd sprocket, and each time you go to your upkeep or have a card that says crank, the crank counter moves back from 3 to 1, and then up 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like that. This means that you can stack your contraptions if you want them like this. You could have a few in sprocket 1 and 3, for example, and then just have a very explosive sprocket 2, meaning that whenever the crank counter hits sprocket 2, you'll have a very, very good turn. Or you could do it like this, where you can stack all of them in an even capacity so that when the crank counter hits each and every one, you have a reasonably good time despite whatever turn you might be on. You have to remember as well that all of the contraptions not only count as artifacts, but they also count as being on the battlefield, which means that shatter effects or things that interact with artifacts do count contraptions, meaning you can destroy your opponent's contraptions with destroy artifact effects, but they don't go to the graveyard, you idiot! They go to the scrap heap, which is different from the graveyard, different deck, different graveyard. Get with the fucking times. And then it means that you can get them back if you have a card that has the reassemble mechanic, which is a little bit like the assemble mechanic. Rather than like return from the graveyard to the battlefield, you reassemble a contraption that has been destroyed, and it goes back into the assemble route, and you do the whole thing all over again. Does that fucking make sense to you? Did that make sense to you?
Well, of course I understand it. I designed it.
Both of these mechanics are downright silly on the surface and also wildly experimental for Magic. Whilst I doubt contraptions in their current form will ever be printed with a black border, the augment mechanic from this set was revisited, albeit in a less exciting and interesting way, in Ikoria 3 years later with the mutate mechanic. To me, it's this experimentation that foreshadows innovation within quote-unquote normal Magic that will always be the true genius of silver border sets. But I wanted to make sure that I wasn't seeing patterns where there weren't any, or making assumptions based on a lack of evidence. Luckily, Gavin once again was very forthcoming with answers to my questions.
The innovation is a primary selling point of doing unsets. Yes, of course, making funny cards and delighting fans is great, but also it lets us test and learn with a wider audience about what sticks and is memorable, plus what people are okay doing. Often, these things would take a lot of rule support to work in traditional Magic. So if they work in Un with some not real words, let's try them there. Internally, when the product is being pitched, the innovations that have come out of unsets is always one of the big things discussed. It's a very real benefit.
Yeah, so one of the things, whenever I try to pitch internally an unset, the big thing I always explain to them is, look, we're just doing future work. A lot of unsets is just us messing with things that we don't understand yet. And that one of the histories of unsets is there's things we discover that down the road become something. Like, I'll make BFM, and maybe in the vacuum that seems like just a silly card, but one day that becomes Meld. Like, one day someone goes, how can we actually do that in a normal Magic set? And so a lot of what we're doing in unsets is just experimenting and playing. And look, Magic is a hungry monster. It's going to keep evolving. We'll need new things. And there's so many things that I first discovered in unsets that I've then gone back to and used some component of it later in Magic. So the unsets, even if the audience never ever saw it or played with it, it is very valuable to us.
See? See, I was totally right about the thing I've been talking about for the past 50 minutes. All my haters can go suck my... However, Unstable was not without its critics. Not all of the 268 cards that make up this set were experimental game pieces. The set itself had a large number of cards whose mechanics wouldn't seem out of place in a normal game of Magic. Vanilla creatures like Beast and Show, cards with mundane effects like Amateur Auteur, even cards which used the set's mechanics like Spell Suck felt somewhat bland amongst the kind of cards that people had come to expect from unsets. Additionally, the justification for their inclusion isn't anything special. When posed with the question as to why quote-unquote normal cards were being included in an unset, I have 2 degrees in writing and I don't know how to put... Wait, hell, what do you call the ED that you put at the end of words to make them past tense? Past tense! Past tense! That's what it is! Jesus Christ! When posed with this complaint, Rosewater replied that they were there to make the limited environment function, very much learning from one of the main issues with Unhinged that we talked about earlier. Even then, however, care and attention was put into making mundane cards as interesting as possible. Amateur Auteur's art and flavor text goofed around with a range of Magic's previous storylines, recasting them as amateur dramatic renditions. I also see the point of having cards with multiple art versions in the same set as a jab at the older Magic sets which used to do this earnestly. A Magic card's art is the first thing most players' eyes are drawn to, and having mechanically identical cards with significantly different art was and is just needlessly confusing. Oh boy, I'm so glad that Magic the Gathering has stopped doing that practice. Oh my god! This is mirrored in the mechanic variations of cards like Very Cryptic Command, which, for the most part, had the exact same artwork, but radically different mechanical effects. The combination of these two themes in Unstable produced a uniquely bewildering environment where identical cards were presumed to be different, and wildly different cards were presumed to be identical. You could only find this in an unset. Despite the issues that some people did have with the set, it was an undeniable success, both in terms of reception from Magic players, but also financially, which, as we all know, is the only thing that matters. Now, up until this point, we've been talking about Unstable in a semi-vacuum, pretty much only considering it as it pertains to itself and other unsets. But around this time in Magic's history, the tone of the game was in a very interesting place. You see, Unhinged and Unglued existed as comedic oases in the rest of Magic's product line. Sure, you had moments of comedy in most sets, and any set which included goblins needed to include both goofs and gags by default, but in the many years after Unhinged was released, Magic began embracing its own absurdity within its normal sets far more regularly. Remember how I said foul play wouldn't turn too many heads today? Well, it's not because its effect isn't funny, it's because its effect has been incorporated into the norm of Magic's design, both aesthetically and mechanically, with cards like Frogify, Reprobation, and Ichthyomorphosis. And I refuse to do a second take of the reading of that word. You have to remember that when Unglued and Unhinged were released, most of Magic's worlds were pretty tonally consistent. They were either high or low fantasy settings, mostly serious with only glimmers of comedy, mainly found in card name puns and the behaviour of goblins. 1 year after Unhinged was released, however, Ravnica City of Guilds came out, which I consider to be a watershed moment for Magic's tonal direction. Compared to what had come before it, this world was high chaos. There is an entire faction of murder clowns on the plane. The Simic make the Riptide experimenters look like legitimate scientists. You could play with a bureaucracy-themed deck, for heaven's sake. Just look briefly at the Is It. Come on now. The success of Ravnica opened the floodgates for more experimental worlds in the Black Border. This was the kind of aesthetic and mechanical environment in which Unstable was released, an environment that Unglued and Unhinged never had to contrast against, and things have only gotten more wacky, with dwarves wielding scrolls like machine guns, Looney Tunes style silhouettes through the floors of rooms, and the return of the Brushwag, Magic's silliest and best boy. If you'd have shown a 1990s Magic player Greasefang, the cyborg rat motorcycle gang leader, or Bucknard's Everfull Purse, which has you rolling d4s and passing it around the table, and told them that both of these were printed in Magic the Gathering's Black Border, they would have questioned why this was the thing that you used time travel to do. Hell, even cards from Unstable are already being functionally reprinted in Black Border. Neverwinter Hydra and Hydradoodle are nearly identical cards. How could you have looked at Magic at this time and think that it's the silver border that's been watered down and not the black border that's been spiced up?
Yeah, so one of the things is when Unglued first got made, the separation between black border and silver border, if you will, was much farther apart. That there was a much cleaner divide. Now we were playing in space. Like one of the things that Unglued, the Unsets have always been is, look, we're testing the future. Like people don't remember, like Full Art Lands and token cards both started in Unglued. And at the time, people were like, why would anybody ever want those? Like Chris Rush pitched the Full Art Land, and everybody at the company said, well, who would want that? And I mean, I remember when he told me about it, I was like, that sounds awesome. And he goes, yeah, I can't get anybody to make them. And so I just put them in Unglued because, like, no one's going to stop me. It's the weird set, so no one stopped me. And then the audience just fell in love with them. And now, obviously, Full Art Lands are just a part of Magic.
Right or wrong as it may be, the issue of having too much normal Magic in an unset would be cleverly addressed a few years later in Magic's next, and I'd even say greatest, unset of all time. No, not Unsanctioned, you gilded pillock. I'm talking about Magic's real greatest unset. Mystery Boosters. Ah, but you didn't see that one coming, did you? Unless you checked the chapters of the video beforehand, you goddamn spoiled sport. The Mystery Booster. This was Magic the Gathering's largest ever set, containing no less than 1,697 Black Border Magic the Gathering cards from throughout the game's history, and it was designed to be a pre-packaged chaos draft of sorts. The set contained everything from Elesh Norn and Mana Crypt to Bartered Cow and Release the Ants. It was designed so that it would be nearly impossible to formulate any kind of coherent draft or sealed strategy until you saw what was in your packs. Very much that organized anarchy that Rosewater wanted to instill in the design of Unhinged. Organized anarchy, eh? Huh. I didn't know that Magic the Gathering designers were syndicalists. One day, an anarcho-syndicalist will explain that ideology to me in a way that I understand. However, in addition to the staggering number of Black Border cards, this set also included 121 playtest cards. These cards were pretty much as close as you could get to a silver border card without putting a silver border on it. They are very obvious pastiches of actual playtest cards that games designers in Magic the Gathering use in order to develop sets for the future. And I really want to talk about these. These playtest cards featured the kinds of outlandish designs that, in actual R&D, would be rolled back and changed to be more fun, or less complicated, or less utterly rule-breaking. Some of these cards were obvious gags, like one with death. Others, like Blue Win Condition, were genuinely game-ending threats, but a large number of them were simply quirky and experimental Magic cards that fit unassumingly into a variety of draft decks. Growth Charm, Enchantment Eyes, and Graveyard Dig, just to name a few, were decent and experimental Magic cards with a surface level of silliness. Not quite silver border silliness, but certainly enough to make a head turn, especially when coupled with their unique and literally off-kilter design. However, the discerning viewers amongst you would have already noticed a pattern in these cards. all of them either foreshadowed or became actual Magic cards. Growth Charm's formatting, for example, is very reminiscent of Adventures in the Forgotten Realms flavor keywords. Graveyard Dig is an unkeyworded version of the cleave mechanic from Crimson Vow, and Enchantmentize is literally one with the stars, even down to its similar artwork. Other concepts like keyword counters first appeared in these playtest cards. Tybalt the Chaotic was a trial run of Alchemy's Spellbook Planeswalkers. With how portentous these playtest cards are, it wouldn't surprise me in any way to see black border versions of Noxious Bayou in a future Phyrexian set. And a card like Transcantation would be a fascinating answer to the issue of one colour in Magic hoarding all of the good counterspells. Looking at you, Green. I asked Gavin as to what the purpose of these playtest cards were, outside of just the fun of the game. If they, like the silver border cards that came before them, were spaces for designers to innovate beyond the boundaries of black border Magic, and the answer was beautifully enlightening.
When I was pitching Mystery Booster internally, it was very much a selling point that we'd get to try things out and see what we learned. Maybe some cards or mechanics would be beloved enough to do them somewhere else. But it expands beyond just the card mechanics. On a product level, a lot had to be done with Mystery Booster innovations to get that many cards in a set. You see, normally, every Magic card has to go through a complex editing, typesetting, and production process, even if it's 100% reprints. But what we did with Mystery Booster is unlock that if we used the 100% original print-ready file and made no modifications, we could print it as is without that complex process. The Planeswalker symbol put in the corner was just uniformly applied to every card in a layer afterward. Really clever stuff. So because Mystery Booster pioneered this treatment, that unlocked this for things like the list and my coin flip commander deck secret layer, heads I win, tails you lose. None of that would have been possible otherwise.
It still blows my mind just how much of this game, how it looks, how it feels, how it's even made, has been so sculpted and shaped by these silly little joke cards. It's honestly kind of beautiful. Overall, these two sets, Unstable and Mystery Boosters, is where this kind of design clicked the best for me. I've always been gutted that I never got to play with these sets more than once or twice, and never with Mystery Boosters because of, you know. But this close enough to touch blending of the silver border with normal Magic is a beautiful thing, both from a design perspective but also from a player's. Unfortunately, whenever something peaks like this, it is inevitable that what follows is doomed to disappoint. Which brings us onto Magic's next unset, printed February 2020. Unsanctioned. This was a strange semi-set, packaged as 5 pre-constructed mono-coloured half decks, god that is a sentence and a half to say, that you would theoretically smash together to play against your friends with. It was bursting with reprints from throughout the Silver Border's history, but still had a handful of new cards like 5 legendary uncommanders to play with. It also had Flavor Judge, single-handedly the best silver bordered card in all of Magic's history. Not quite a new set, not quite a master set, and not quite precons, Unsanctioned was a plainly peculiar product in, unfortunately, lots of ways that just didn't work. The main issue was that the decks did not click together when they were played together. For example, all of the new legendary creatures in the set had enemy-coloured activated abilities, which meant that you could only ever see one of your cool new legends used fully and consistently. The green-black deck, for example, would be able to use a Cornelia to the fullest extent of her abilities, but Pippa, Queen of Dice, would have consistently lost out on her fun re-roll effect. If you played with an allied coloured deck, it became even worse as your mana base wouldn't let you activate either of your legend's abilities. If you picked the blue-white decks, for example, a card like Alexander Clamilton changed from a unique roll of the dice kind of removal piece into a 0/4 that sometimes let you scry, and if you were playing after sunset, Circadian became a 4/4 with lifelink. Not exactly the bombastic fun you'd expect from a silver-bordered product. Bombastic. Ooh. Ooh, I haven't used that word since secondary school disco. The existence of Underdome in the lists, a kind of silver border fixing land, did allow you to activate abilities of cards whose colours fell outside of your normal mana base, but 2 cards out of 60 letting you play your cool commanders felt pretty bad. Additionally, by nature of Unsanctioned being a product predominantly made up of old cards, much of the selling point that Gavin mentioned a while ago of unexpected innovation both mechanically and comedically would always be partially lost upon a replay. It's not unlike when you sit down with your girlfriend to watch Airplane as a means of preparing yourself to produce a video about spoof comedy, and then when the gag happens where the little girl says that she takes her coffee black like she likes her men, you breathe in to laugh at that joke, but in doing so you accidentally breathe in half a squashy sweet that you are currently eating. You begin to choke and cough it up, but instead of coming out of your mouth, the squashy sweet becomes lodged in your nose. And so you go to A&E because you're really worried that at any moment this sweet is going to either fall down back into your throat and you're going to continue choking, and that was one of the worst experiences of your life, or it's going to remain lodged up there forever and you're going to have surgery to get it removed. And when you're waiting for the bus to take you up to A&E, the sweet has dissolved to such a point that it just randomly falls out of your nostril in quite a disgusting display. And so you get back to your apartment and you rewind the movie about 10 seconds and you try and pick up where you have left off, but by the time you've done that and the joke happens for a second time, it's just not as funny. It's a little bit like that relatable moment, you know? This isn't to say that Unsanctioned added nothing whatsoever to broader Magic. For example, it can't be denied that the idea of pre-packaged half decks was first pioneered by Unsanctioned, but massively improved by Jumpstart, a set that came out a few months after it, and is easily the best thing Magic has put out in years. God, I'm so excited to talk about that set properly. I'm gonna add it to my list. God, I need to do my job faster. Sorry, I'd love to keep recording, but it sounds like somebody is pushing a steam train down the street outside my window. What are you transporting there, King? Cantankerous spanners? Jesus, it's loud. I just feel that this format doesn't work for a kind of card with such a limited pool to draw from. Using Jumpstart as a comparison, those decks had the whole of Magic's history to work with in terms of a card pool, and there was no expectation that every single card within their lists would be some kind of spotlight grabbing deal. The card pool and mechanics of Unset, however, are far more limited and the expectations far greater. A black border creature with prowess, or a card which produces a food token, can work in any Magic deck, regardless if synergies exist or not. Augment, dice rolling, and squirrel artwork, on the other hand, are all very parasitic mechanics that require specific cards to synergize with, or they wither up and die. Unsanctioned had to walk an impossibly narrow line between ensuring that all the decks had cards that synergized with other decks, and ensuring that all decks felt unique and not like color-shifted versions of one another. But that's not to say that silver border cards should remain limited to draft formats. And I think that Unsanctioned could have been the product to have proved this. Now, this is just my personal opinion, TM, but most of Unsanctioned's legendary creatures would have been perfect as the face cards of silver border commander decks. If there was ever a casual format that could have acted as a vehicle to legitimize the silver border as something to play outside of limited, it would have been Commander. And I just want you to put a pin in that idea of legitimacy because it's going to become very relevant very soon. And this isn't coming from nowhere. It's not like this idea isn't something that Magic designers considered even with Unsanctioned itself. For example, the name, mechanics, creative templating which gives it WooBug color identity, lamp shading of that creative templating in the flavor text, and this article by Mark Rosewater suggesting that Surging Commander was intended to be a card to be run as a commander of an EDH deck certainly hints at the idea of silver border commander.
The thing that's crazy, the thing that's absolutely crazy to me about it is the fact that like we made it specifically in like the cards were made for this audience. You know what I'm saying? They were made for a casual audience. And so it like the dagger in my heart that like the thing, like literally the audience the cards were made for are like want to play it. Like I get people all the time, they'll write to me and say, I love Host Augment. Could you please make it in black border? And I'm like, I made it for you. It's like, can you just remake it, but just tell us we can play it? So it saddens me.
But anyway, Silver Border EDH is an entire separate conversation to have, and this video is already, how long? Oh, Jesus Christ. But before we move on, there was something Mark explained during our interview that I really want to include, because I think it sheds a lot of light on the very foundations and origins of this set.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about Unsanctioned was, it didn't start from what could we do with an unset. It came from, Gavin Verhey was making a product that we codenamed Parachute. And what Parachute was is, hey, every once in a while something happens and the last minute we need a set. And instead of scrambling to make one, what if we just made one ahead of time? And then when we need to pull the ripcord, we can. And so Gavin went and said, oh, well, what could we make? And what he realized about the unsets is they're kind of timeless. Like, it doesn't matter when it comes out. It's, it's very open-ended. And if you make things borrowing from, like, no other set's going to reprint uncards, right? And so it was a space he could play in that he could do something that he thought the audience would enjoy, that it was messing with nobody else. It was kind of the perfect Parachute, like, product because it lived in a vacuum. It could come out whenever. And so that's how it got made. It didn't really start as an unproduct. It started as this other thing, but Gavin recognized that. And then he came to me and said, what do you think of this? I always am a fan of making more unproducts. So I was like, sure. We made a bunch of new cards, so there'll be some new cards in, and we had fun designing the new cards. And then it was neat to reprint. We had never reprinted any uncards before, so we'd never done that. So there's a lot of uncards, like there's stuff from old unsets that are really hard to get your hands on just because it came out so long ago. And so it was fun just to bring back and let people have more access to that. And it was neat to make a product that could exist by itself, which is you can just take Unsanctioned and play it. It's just a playable product out of the box. And we had never had like an unproduct that was playable out of the box. So that's how it came about.
Unsanctioned always seemed to me to be the odd one out of the family, and finding out that its origins were completely divorced from every other Silver Border set until then makes so much sense now. It is, however, unfortunate that a set which only became Silver Border at a later point in its development was also the last set ever to be released in the Silver Border. But I refuse to move on without talking about Flavor Judge some more. Let's go, baby! Flavor Judge. This is easily the cleanest and most Silver Border card I have ever seen. The proxy artist ALK Altus even sent me a version with Legendary scrawled on the formatting so I could play it as a commander if I wanted to. Its ability is obviously way outside of the rules of the game, but not nearly as complicated or as arduous as other effects of this caliber. You're not playing a game of rock, paper, scissors. You're not giving another player in another game a creature of yours for a moment. You're simply asking whether or not a thing makes sense. And this effect is the easiest way in the world to explain to someone what flavor is. Does it make sense for an effect or interaction to happen? If the answer is yes, such as a pirate being killed with Walk the Plank, it's flavorful. If it doesn't, such as a killer whale being killed with Walk the Plank, it does not. One of my favorite social media accounts of all time is a Twitter account based on this card called Flavor Judge Draws, which displays the logic of card interactions such as Rambunctious Mutt being able to destroy Parhelion 2 in a simple comic form. I love this account so much. It exists because of Flavor Judge. I have notifications on Twitter for this account's new tweets. Do you understand how much I need to like something for me to turn on Twitter notifications for it? If there was ever a single card that I felt captured the heart of what it meant to be printed in Silver Border, it's Flavor Judge. But its existence is very bittersweet. Magic did finally print the perfect Silver Border card, but it would also be one of the last Silver Border cards they ever printed. Except for all the holiday cards they sent to YouTubers and stuff, but it's a lot less dramatic if I acknowledge their existence, isn't it? Anyway, let's talk about Unfinity. Originally scheduled to release on the 1st of April 2022, but since pushed back to the last quarter of 2022. And thank God for that, because there's no fucking way I would have gotten this video out for that date, Jesus Christ. In an article late last year, Mark Rosewater revealed that Unfinity would be a fully black border set with a mixture of cards that would be legal to play in Eternal formats like Legacy and EDH, and other cards which would exclusively be legal to the Unfinity limited environment. And you'll be able to tell which card is which, thanks to one having a normal holofoil stamp and the other one having an acorn-shaped holofoil stamp. Which, if I'm going to nitpick, isn't nearly the kind of aesthetic masterstroke of differentiation that the silver border was, especially seeing as holofoil stamps are about the size of a baby's fingernail and Magic already has like 5+ different kinds of them already. Different kinds of holofoil stamp, not baby's fingernails. I should make that absolutely clear. There's a lot of interesting parts of this article, not least its analysis of Sword of Dungeons and Dragons. Its design had, at the time it was printed in 2017, been overtly ridiculous. A card that references another game outside of Magic, which uses D20s as a mechanic, and which creates a gold-coloured dragon creature token. But a lot has changed since then. For one thing, England has continued to get worse. But, more relevantly, the limits of Magic have expanded. There are cards that you can legally play in Eternal formats that reference The Walking Dead and Street Fighter. There's a whole Dungeons & Dragons set where D20 rolling was a core mechanic. Indeed, the only thing preventing this sword from being a fully legitimate black border Magic card is the fact that the token it creates is of an illegal colour. Equally, as mentioned before, a lot of cards in Unstable, including pretty much the entirety of the Augment and Host mechanic, really wouldn't have felt too out of place in Black Border in the nearly 5 years that have passed since the release of that set. So the designers reassessed the content of Unfinity and found that whilst a lot of cards wouldn't ever work in Black Border, a non-insignificant number of them did pass a certain silver border test. This test was a more streamlined version of the list of objectives that Rosewater and his team had worked with for previous unsets. Each prospective card from Unfinity was tested to see if they fell into any of the following groupings. On first blush, these groupings don't seem all that different to the disastrous test that the designers of Unhinged used to the detriment of their set. Indeed, Unfinity's test criteria of doesn't feel right in Black Border is startlingly similar to Unhinged's cannot be appropriate for normal Magic. Also, just want to point out, it's late in the video, but fucking hell, saying Unhinged is... Oh, it's so unbelievably difficult to pluralize an adjective. Holy fuck, this has been a nightmare of a script to read. However, the fact that Unfinity has done away with the silver border and is mixing eternally legal cards with the wacky jokes you'd expect from an unset transforms the impact this test will have. It means that cards that don't fall into any of these criteria that would otherwise be grand additions to an unset can and will still be printed and their ideas still explored in Magic's game space. All this test does now is draw a legal distinction between silly fun and broken fun, rather than fully cutting them out like what happened with Unhinged. And there are more benefits to the replacement of the silver border within unsets. As I've already mentioned, a card printed in silver border cannot be exactly reprinted in a black border, meaning that any cards in this set where the designers really feel like they've nailed the design don't have to be given a full and arguably unnecessary makeover in order to make their way into normal Magic. And cards being played in normal Magic, even casual formats, has been the dream of many Magic designers for years. Take that pin out of the bit of paper that you wrote legitimacy on in the previous section of this video and look at it. Really look at it. Stops looking like a word after a while, doesn't it? Just let it sink in. All those symbols. You ever been to a Turkish prison? Since its inception, the Silver Border has struggled for legitimacy in the eyes of Magic players, as Mark describes quite mirthlessly in his article.
When Silver Border was dubbed not for tournament play, that meant not for Vintage, Legacy, or Standard, but for every other format, especially the casual ones. Over the years, Silver Border slowly shifted to end up meaning not for any official format, casual or not, which flies in the face of what it was originally intended to do.
And unfortunately, I fully agree with Mark's perspective here. I know very few people, myself before making this video included, who wouldn't think twice about seeing an uncard pop up in a casual game of Magic without the person playing them asking if it's okay to run them before the game starts. The way Unfinity is set to narrow the distinction between normal Magic and the spiritual successors to the Silver Border down to a razor-thin line is sure to raise the legitimacy of seeing uncards played in normal Magic. And this is the third take I've done that, and each time I say the word sure like I'm a fucking French duke, so we're just gonna run with it. But my enthusiasm for uncards being taken a tad more seriously as the amazing game pieces they are is also tinged with a certain amount of apprehension and sadness. I can't help but think back to the impact Future Sight had on Eternal formats and worry about the tightrope that the designers of Unfinity are walking between watering down the fun and essence of Silver Border cards to fit them into black borders on one side and letting completely absurd mechanics to run rampant throughout Magic's Eternal formats on the other. I also worry that the mechanics of Unfinity, the two main ones that this article suggests will be featured on black border cards, will lose their edge and potential as playgrounds for experimentation. Unglued's dice rolling and Unstable's augment walked outside of the rules so that Adventures in the Forgotten Realms dice rolling and Icoria's Mutate could fly within them. Or at least jog. There's also part of me that questions whether or not this was wholly a decision based on gameplay. This is purely speculation on my part, but I can't help but notice, for example, the incompatibility with the concept of Silver Border cards and borderless collectibles. Unfinity is already promised to come packaged with borderless shocklands, alternative art versions of cards, and does have collector boosters. It would seem a little bit too happy of an accident for the first unset since the borderless phenomenon started infecting every Magic product from Zendikar Rising onwards to also be the one in which the decades-old Silver Border was replaced with something that would accommodate that product and formatting. But hey, that's just a theory. A money theory? Alternatively, this all could simply be the culmination of a decades-long vendetta Mark Rosewater has been holding onto since The Cheese Stands Alone was snubbed by the 8th edition design team. With that company decision way back in 8th edition, setting the precedent that all Silver Border cards can never be printed in Black Border, the conflict between the desires to legitimize these cards in the eyes of the player base and the blanket ban on their existence within normal Magic was inevitably going to end with either the fundamental overhaul of years of WotC precedent or the end of the Silver Border. As sad as I may be to see the Silver Border evicted from its home, I am not without huge hopes for this set. And a lot of that hope was drawn from my conversation with Mark, who took me through the process behind Unfinity and the lessons that were learned from previous unsets.
Yeah, I think the big lesson of the early unsets, there are a couple. I will cheat and answer with more than one thing. But so number one was when we first made the unsets, the idea was it was this supplemental thing that you mixed in with Magic. So it wasn't designed to be its own product. It was designed to be something much like the cards I talked about where here's weird magic tricks and you mix them in with the magic trick. That same sort of feel was here's weird things and just put them in your deck. But it wasn't meant to be its own product. And for both Unglued and Unhinged, that was our philosophy. But what we found was no matter what we told people, they just wanted to treat it like its own product. They just kind of wanted to draft it by itself. And so with Unstable, we're like, okay, we're just going to do that. Like, stop fighting human nature. That's what people want. We're just going to make that. And so one of the fun things about Unstable that I'm really proud of was it was just made to be this really cool experience, this limited experience that takes all the joy and fun of what an unset can and brings it to limited in a way that was maximized for limited. The other big thing that unsets have done is I've realized that what makes a very good unset is we take something we've learned in normal Magic and then apply kind of the unness to it, if you will. And so what Unstable was, you know what players love? Faction sets. Factions, you know, Ravnica really put faction sets on the table, and we've made a lot of them since then. And like, I want to make an unfaction set, so we did that. There were 5 factions, and for example, we made use of watermarks mechanically to represent factions, which we can't actually do in a normal set, even though you think we can, but we can't. So it allowed us to do things that we always wanted to do in a faction set, but weren't able to do. Unfinity, I said, okay, I want to do something else that Magic does, and that is a top-down set. And so the idea of a top-down set is you say, okay, I want to take some trope space, I want to take something that the audience knows, and I want to bring it to Magic. Is it Gothic horror? Is it Greek mythology? Is it fairy tales? You know, what is it? Because we want the audience to say, oh, I know that thing. And so what happened was Dawn Murren was the art director. And so I went to her, she and I had worked together on Unstable, and I said, okay, Dawn, I want to do a top-down set. I want to do something we've never done before. And so we both went off, and Dawn came back and said, okay, I got it. Let's do retro science fiction. Let's just go to a completely different genre space. And I said, you know what I always want to do? I've always wanted to do a circus, you know, and just, man, it's silly enough that Magic doesn't quite want to do a circus.
No circuses in Magic. Are the Rakdos a joke to you, Rosewater?
Oh, fuck me. That voice is so painful to do immediately after COVID. Why did I do that?
And then as we worked on, we realized that there wasn't enough in the circus, so we added on amusement park, then we added on carnival. And when the dust settled, we ended up with our retro sci-fi space carnival. And the one thing about the set that's a lot of fun that the audience will see is it's very much a top-down set. Take anything you love about a circus or amusement park or a carnival or science fiction. We also added a lot of science fiction into it. And we just did all this top-down stuff. And so it was a lot of fun to take something a little on the sillier side of things, but much like Gothic horror, hey, everybody's been to an amusement park or a circus or a carnival. Like it's something people have experienced. And so it was a lot of fun saying, how do I bring that experience within the game of Magic? And another great thing about all those things is they are places you go that you have fun. There are places you go that you go, I want to go there. I will enjoy myself. And so it's a lot of fun to bring people to something like, from a resident standpoint, it's like, oh, this is something that's fun. Like fun is baked into it. When you go to a carnival, you want to have fun. So the set really took that as a jumping off point. And like one of the things I'm super happy with, and people will see when they get to play with it is, you know, really, it's just dripping with lots of both fun stuff and just resonant top-down stuff that I think people will really enjoy.
And additionally, Mark had this to say about his personal involvement with the set.
So one of the unique things about Unfinity is I got special permission to do something I've never done before. So normally I work on the beginning of the product. I work in the early days, I worked on design, now I work on vision design. I do the beginning part. But for Unfinity, I got permission to run the product from exploratory, through vision, through set design, through polish. I did the entire set from beginning to end. I led it the whole way through. And so this is if you like Mark Rosewater Magic, there's no set more Mark Rosewater than Unfinity. This has my thumbprints all over it. I mean, I worked with lots and lots of other very talented people. Chris Mooney was my right-hand person. Dawn Mirren was a really awesome art director. Andy Sardellis did the card concepting. Ari Zarilnik did all the naming and stuff. Like, I had an awesome team, but like, for the first time ever, a lot of times I make cards and then other people sort of like do what they're going to do with them. And so the finished product, it's very much inspired by my vision, but it's somebody else's hands on it. Nobody else's hands. I mean, this is very much mine from beginning to end. So if you love unsets, this is as as it can be. And I got involved in every process. I was involved in the naming and the flavor text. I was involved with the card concepting. I was involved in every aspect. And I worked with really, really talented people. And everybody brought their A game. And Unfinity is my favorite unset ever. I mean, I love Unglued like a baby. It means a lot to me. I'm very proud of Unstable. Like Unhinged has some issues, but Unfinity is the best. It's the best unset I've ever made. So if you love unsets, if unsets are something that make you happy, I can't wait for you to play Unfinity.
And having spoken at length with Mark about unsets, indeed, having talked to a whole host of people who know how passionate he is about unsets, I fully expect most, if not all, of my anxieties surrounding Unfinity to be blown away the moment that the set does finally release. Even if I do think that Unfinity is a stupid name and not in a fun way. Like, okay, sorry, not to be a jackass or anything, but really? We ran out of words that begin with four products in? But, meaningless critiques from an internet nobody that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things aside, the process of making this video has completely opened my eyes, both to the genius of the unset and the beauty of the silver border. Heck, even as I am filming this section and editing the last bits of this video, Double Masters 2 is in preview stage, and Cryptic Spires is a card that has been shown off, which just feels ripped straight from the bowels of the silver border in its design. And there is not a shadow of a doubt in my head that there are tens, if not hundreds of examples of things that were printed as jokes in the silver border or in Magic the Gathering's playtest borders becoming genuine pieces of normal Magic that I haven't mentioned in this video. What began as a parody that gave plausible deniability for Mark Rosewater to push the boundaries of what Magic the Gathering could be has since evolved into an invaluable tool for experimentation and innovation within Magic, and is one of the major reasons why this game has remained fresh for so many years. And like, to be honest, this video began as a joke. I started writing this in January thinking that would be an easy thing to get out for April 1st and be like, I don't know, here are my favourite uncards. Aren't these a bit wacky? And then when I actually sat down and started doing research into the process behind making unsets and what they actually represent within our game, it blew my mind as to just how underappreciated they and the silver border is. Everything from set mechanics to gameplay pieces to aesthetic decisions to product concepts, all of it owes its existence to the unset and the silver border. And what a punchline that is! Now, whilst the silver border as we know it may be dead, its spirit lives on. The experimentation it allowed, the jokes it could tell, the boundaries it could safely push can all still be achieved within the borders of the cards which act as the silver border's legacy. And just before I end the video, I'd like to show you a wee clip that Mark said during our interview. I still can't believe I actually interviewed Mark Rosewater for this video. Pinch me, I must be dreaming. I want to show you this clip because I think what he says here cuts to the heart of what unsets represent and what the silver border represented.
And I also want to say this to the audience out there is, if you see an uncard that you enjoy, no one is saying that you have to play every uncard. If you see one that you enjoy, like talk to people you play with and just put it in your deck. Like they are made for casual play. So if you're playing Commander or other casual formats and you go, ooh, this seems really fun, you don't have to wait for us one day to make the black border version of the thing. Just play it now. You can play it now. And like I said, so much, like a lot of the things that are in unsets are there for really weird, quirky reasons. The reason they're not in a normal Magic set is like things that you behind the scenes, you don't know behind the scenes. You might not even understand why it's there. Like when Unfinity comes out, there's going to be cards that are Eternal Legal and cards that are Acorn, which we've not Eternal Legal. And the audience is really not going to understand some of them. I'm going to answer a lot of questions like, why can't this be Eternal? I'm like, well, here's this weird rule reason why it can't. Or here's the problem it causes in Legacy tournaments, whatever. Here's the reason why we can't. But, they're so accessible and so fun. And I don't know. I really want the audience to sort of realize that you are sort of keeping yourself from what Magic can be if you somehow think of uncards as just being not Magic.
As I hope that you've gleaned from this fucking documentary, the unset silver borders and playtest cards are as much a legitimate part of Magic as any normal game piece. This game is better for having them in it, and your games will be better for using them. So go out and celebrate the innovativeness of these silly cards and all the legacies that they have left. Who knows? Maybe you'll find out that you're one cheese that doesn't stand alone. Oh, it's mirror, mirror. It wasn't cheese stands alone. And I also held the cards back to the camera because I opened the pack backwards. So that wasn't like even mildly as good of an ending as I thought it was going to be. This cost me $33 to buy, by the way. I bought this when I was over in bloody America. That was a useful use of that cash money. Oh, also, I know that some of you in my comments are already like typing out, I didn't see you try and sneak Cheaty Face into your video. Well, guess what, idiot? He's been here the whole time. There's been a layer over every piece of footage in this video where Cheaty Face is at 1% opacity. Go back and check. I win, dickhead. I fucking win! Oh, thanks for watching, folks. Big old long video, but as I said in my money video, I wanted to actually set a lot of time aside and just keep going with a project like this until it was actually done. And I think it turned out really, really good. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I want to thank a couple of people before I get to the credits. First off, I really want to thank everybody who contributed and lent their voice to this video. I'd really like to thank Guy from Search Your Library. I'd love to thank Sophie from Mars, and I'd also love to thank We're in Hell, because all of them added a little bit of extra spice to the video with some extra voice work. Also, of course, want to thank Gavin Verhey and Mark Rosewater for getting involved and lending both their voice and also their perspectives to this video. I really cannot appreciate that enough. I think that their presence elevated this from a big old rant to a genuinely interesting piece of media. And of course, want to thank my $10 patrons. Without my patrons, I can't make videos because I wouldn't have any money. And my $10 patrons are just some of the folks who contribute a nice big old large share of that. So really thanks so much, folks, and thanks to all of my lovely patrons who keep my head above water and keep me making videos and keep me paying rent and all that good stuff. And so, to thank them, I would like to say a big thank you to 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a class war, a filthy communist bunny, a fool of 5 colours, a gay American couple, a lax verdant force, a pangolin-shaped servo, a screaming Batman, a waste of a perfectly good skeleton, Akumi the Reaper, Adam Gable, Adam Ross Henry, Aesthetic Dialectic, AJ Ingram, Alex Berman, Alex Flynn, Alex from Adelaide? Oh, that's in Australia, isn't it? Alguy _D_sysy, or otherwise known as Barry, apparently, Alice Perales, Ali, an alt-right sleeper agent who gives money to communists, because Ida Kurt, and then in parentheses, probably tilts for Sona, close parentheses, I draw penises on pastries, an entire council of ghosts, an exceedingly large moose, an exhausted capybara, an Umbreon pastry, Andrew Elf, Anne Morgana, Anonymous Anarchist, Aqua Regia, Ashnod, Austin L, Bacchus98, Basu Gasu Baku Hatsu Baku Matsu, Bazinga Bongos Badonka Donk Needs Love 2, Ben Pike, Benjamin Easter, Benjai Skagboat Esquire the Fourth, Big Rat Games, Bitter Cuppa Joe, Blake Evers, Bobby, Brian Dunn, Brian Rodham, but you can call me Thrakazod, Caleb Walton, Kalulu, Cancerian Insomniac, Charles Cohen, Chelsea Talbot, Chloe, Krista Voss, Cloud Chaser Kestrel, Cognitive Glitch, Commie Mommy, Crockist, Curtis Paul Fleming, Dark Kajin, Darth Pink Hippo, David Reynolds, Deadpan Goff, Dean Pio Quidio, I hope I get that right, Dr. Lambic, Duncan Lindsay, Edward Gordon, Exidian, Etienne Champion Masson, I'm assuming it's French, Everybody Loves Robots, Faxel, Felix Mortem, Fiona, Fofa, Foxy Dean, Future Beagle, Garrett Winters, Gavin Verhey, oh, hello Gavin, George Anderson, Georgian Tom, Gitu Nullmage, Grand Regent Pie, Grey Days, Guilty Sonder, Have You Considered Human Rights Maybe, Hen Honkin, Homosexual Bird That Steals Shiny Things, How to PNP, Hoopered Up, Who Elliot, Hypercube NTG, I am abusing my powers to make Spice 8 Rack say silly things like this here. I am saying this only because our global economic system does not intrinsically support artistic expression. I want Emrakul to dominate me. At this point in the credits, it sounds like I'm having an argument with myself. Imbecilious Rex, in response I bolt myself, in response table flip, intergalactic reverb, Jake and Vraska are a T4T couple, Jake Bland, Jack F, Jack the Mindfucker, Jackson Seamayer, Jackson West, Jacob Williams, Jake Colburn, James Schaefer, Jennifer Klein, Jess Will Eat the Delicious Cards Yum Yum, Jessica Settle, Johnny Rifle, Josh, Joshua M. Stephan, Julie Bunn, Julia Powell, Julius Home, June Violet Aino, June Duty Bound, Just Mild Lilac, Carlia Whithart, Kate B, Kay Santum, Khans of Tarkia is anti-Sultai revisionist propaganda, Ku Zombie, Kurdape Apologizer, Kamoli, Let Zimone Say Fuck, Rio, Kyle Denley, Leone, Lover of Dragons, Let There Be Words, Lightfoot, Lily of the North Star, Lily Sappho, yes, I gave myself 2 names that just mean lesbian, literally a ghost that pushes over candles, Ill Milk Tray, Lonis Cryptomarxologist, Linnea, Madame Monroe, Magic Arcanum, Magic Fellow, Mao Zedong's Little Red Cookbook, Marcellus Brown, Mario Romero, Matthew Miles, Matthew Butler, Matthew Short, Matthew Speedle, Max Makes Magic, Meow Serita, Metal Gamer 21, Miaglo Maxwell, Micha, Midi Bat, Mike Mavramatis, Molly Felon, Moose, Nobody, Nate Zabinski, Nathan Speepisman Harris, N. Ben, Nicola Prasik, Nom 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 Yoshi, Nom 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 Yoshi! Ogrok and Ogrok Jr., Omar Al-Tibahi, One Single Mongus, Onion Knight Val, Oops All Signy, Pappy Markov Was a Mistake, Patty Fism, Peter Carter, Phoenix Swans, Phil Gamesh, Punished Vellum Scalene, Quazu, Rambrest, Rebelak, Replicase, Riley Quest, Robson Yukon, Ross Conklin, Sam Cook, Samuel Kona, Scrimblow Bimblow, the lovable Scrunko, that gets me every time, several goblins in a trench coat, Sean, Skolaton, Sky Johnson, Sorry Zia, Stephen Christopher, Steve Grohl, Stink Stifel Soria, Swan Hunter, Tamio's New Phyrexian Clunge, Tanner the Big Sexy Dentist, Taylor Street, the A Positive Blood Type Goddess of Death, the Cutest Corgi, the Jellybean Warlock, the Poltism, the Farmer Cyrus, the Wood, Thelon, the One Who Plays, the Reaper of You, Thomas Saint, Totally a Spy, aka He Who Simps for Emrakul, hashtag Free Her, Travis K, Vats3, Wappa, Wasson and Watcher1932, Well You Asked For It, Wesley, that rat bastard communist, Why Is There No Milk on Bant? Because They Are Rakdos Intolerant, Wicked Haiku, William Cox, William Lyndon Smith, Wolf and Stoat, a gay Americana love story, Ya Boy, Wild and New Year, Yabu, Yukai Akama, Zack Ninja Attack, and Xanoron. These fucking credits are getting so long, I don't want to have to stop reading people's names out, so if you want to help me out and join this list but don't want to bring forth the inevitable removal of me reading out the credits, then feel free to join at $5 or below. Big love to all of you. This is a wonderful, it's a wonderful problem to have. I have far too many people to read their names out for. But anyway, I'm rambling. I'm going to just finish off this video. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And as always,
stay spicy. I got different stay spicy.
That was perfect. Thank you ever so much.